Hey everybody, Chris here from It's Mead Made, and today we start Resin 101. I'm going to be going over all the things that you need to know about resin printing. So some of the things that I'm going to be covering today is the differences between a resin or SLA 3D printer and a FDM 3D printer. And I'm going to be talking about the safety precautions that you have to take with resin 3D printers. It's not like FDM. There are safety precautions when it comes to this. And also maybe you've been on the fence about getting a resin printer and you just don't know. I'm going to be talking about whether it's really right for you or not and some of the things to think about before you get one. But on the other hand, if you already have one and you're new to resin printing, this is going to be a good foundation for you and there might be some stuff in here you don't know. So let's go ahead, jump into this video. We're all familiar with our FDM printers. It takes a spool of filament, and what it does is it takes that filament through a hot nozzle, and then that hot nozzle will actually melt this filament down and squeeze it through the nozzle and draw the layer. And then when it's done drawing a layer, it moves up and does it all again. And I tell you what, I love my FDM printers, but when it comes to time, I love my resin printers a whole lot more. Because you just have a bottle, you pour it in, and it does the entire layer all at once. And then it moves up, does the entire layer all at once again, then moves up. So a resin printer will actually print a whole lot faster. And the greatest thing about a resin printer is you can fill up your build plate. I mean, load it. And it is not going to change the time at all. Unlike an FDM printer, if you put a bunch of things on that plate, you know it's got to do every single little thing and it takes forever to print. But the beauty about resin is it doesn't matter how many things that you put on your build plate. What matters is the height, because of how many times it actually has to print a layer. So just so you know the basics of how a resin 3D printer works is on the bottom of the 3D printer there is a screen, and this screen is what allows the UV light to show through. Because the resin we use is UV sensitive, so it will cure with UV light. So essentially we are curing the resin to be hardened for what is being exposed through that screen. Then you have your vat. And at the bottom of that vat is a clear plastic, which is called a FEP sheet. And that will allow the UV light to show through and cure the resin onto the build plate. So then the build plate is actually going all the way into the resin, and then that light is turning on and it cures itself to the build plate. And after it's done with that, it lifts up out of the resin and then comes right back down, but it comes back down with a little bit of a space, and that space is actually what is going to be curing to the last piece. So it will actually just keep doing this. So it doesn't just pull itself straight out. Even though some of those cool time lapses out there looks like it just pulls itself out of the goo, it actually does this, and it just keeps bouncing back and forth and pulling itself out of the resin. So unlike FDM printers where we're always fighting gravity and those supports might fall and then it's printing in midair and has nothing to do except fail, with an SLA printer, we're actually using gravity because we're pulling it out and it's hanging. So you don't need as many beefy supports as you do in FDM printing. Now, for those of you that are those FDM printers, I'm sure you know what Cura is, and Cura is that slicer. But with resin, you can't use an FDM slicer for SLA printing. You have to use an SLA slicer. The two big ones out there is EPAX and Lychee. And those two are great programs. I like them both, but EPAX is one of those that, you know, I started with it and I've used it forever and I'm just comfortable in it. But more and more I'm using Lychee because it's got a lot of great features in it. And it works a lot like Cura in the sense of you have to bring in your model, you have to support your model, and then you slice it. And then after it's sliced, you save it to a jump drive or a disk, and then you can put it in your printer to print. I'm going to be doing another video going more in depth on the slicer. Some of the big trade-offs when it comes to SLA versus FDM, in my opinion, FDM is just, as soon as you get it out of the box and put it together, you can hit print, as long as you've got filament. You're never really having to worry about anything. And when a print fails, you just scrape your build plate and then you start it again. Or you have to reslice it and start it again, depending on the failure. When it comes to resin 3D printing, it's not like that. I hope you don't just jump into resin printing like I did, where I didn't even realize I needed gloves. Like, I wasn't even fully aware of all the safety precautions that resin printing actually needs. I'm going to be doing another video specifically talking about the safety of resin 3D printing, but for the most part, here are the main things you need to just get started with resin 3D printing. First, you're going to need nitrile gloves. Now, you cannot use just latex gloves. They will not work. You have to use nitrile. So nitrile gloves, and I would get a box of them because you use them every single time you touch anything in the area of your resin 3D printer. Next is safety glasses. Now, safety glasses is a must because honestly, you deal with this resin and you never know what's going to happen, and it can easily splash up in your eyes, and you want to have some type of protection to block your eyes. Next is a respirator. Now, the thing about a respirator is, if you're sanding, absolutely. But if you're just printing and pouring resin and getting into your 3D printer, it's not a mandatory thing. Some people always use respirators because they're very sensitive to the smells of resin. Resin does have an odor. Now, I will say some resins have more of an odor than others, but for the most part, all of the different kinds that I've used in the past, they all have some type of smell to them. Another good thing I can't just show for you right now is a ventilation system. You need some type of ventilation. You want this not to be in a closed space that has no airflow, because that smell of resin can build up, and it doesn't matter who you are, it will bother you. So you definitely want to put it in a place where you actually can get good airflow. One person has told me that they actually set theirs up in their bathroom. They could just turn on the vent and there you go. So it's really wherever you can set it up to be able to have proper airflow. Whether that's in a garage where you can open the door sometimes, or by a window and keep the window open with a little fan. Obviously depending on the time of year and the weather. But ventilation is one thing you absolutely should have. Another thing is a scraper. You definitely need a scraper. Most 3D printers just come with them. But if you don't have one, you need to get one. And it's good to have a metal edged scraper. At least I like the metal edged scrapers. But some people will actually have 3D printers that have a mag base, where it's just a magnetic plate that peels off. That's what my EPAX E10 has. And it's fantastic. But there are times where I still need to use a scraper. Also, some isopropyl alcohol. I always use the 91% isopropyl alcohol. Now, this stuff is what you use to clean resin. It will actually break down the resin to where you can clean it really well. And this is also what you use to wash your 3D prints once they're done. So, start stocking up on this stuff because you go through a lot of it. And when it comes to just using the alcohol, I also have these cotton pads, and the cotton pads is what I use to clean out my vat, because I don't want to use paper towels because that can scratch up the bottom of your vat. So you want to use some soft cotton pads. You could use cotton balls, but it's a mess. So I switched to cotton pads, and these are just makeup pads. Originally I stole them from my wife, but then I just started buying them in bulk. So I got a huge box of these for cheap on Amazon. Also, I personally think it's always a good thing to have some type of mat or plastic to lay down where you're actually messing with your 3D prints. So any dripped resin or anything like that will actually fall there, and you can easily wipe it up with some alcohol and keep everything nice and clean. Me personally, I'm a fan of the silicone mats. These things are fantastic, and I just buy the extra large ones. As you see, it's the same mat that I keep at my desk that I paint on. When I find something I like, I just keep buying the same thing and find different uses for it. But a silicone mat works wonderfully. So when you're done 3D printing your model, now the work actually begins. Because it's not like FDM where you just rip off those supports, do a little sanding, and you're done. With resin, this is when the work actually happens. So you actually have to take it off, you have to remove all of your supports, and there's multiple ways to remove supports, and they're, trust me, a lot easier than FDM. And once you've removed those supports, then you have to wash it in alcohol. and you're going to wash it in the IPA and get it really good, because the alcohol will break down all of the uncured resin. You want to make sure you do a very good job at doing this, because if you don't, all of that uncured resin, when you cure it, will just harden to your model, to where if it's stuck in a joint and you try to put that arm into that shoulder socket, it won't fit right because you didn't clean it good enough. Sometimes it's the model, but a good chunk of the time it's because the model isn't cleaned enough. So then after you've washed it in isopropyl alcohol, then you let it dry. So then, after you let it dry, it's time to cure it. And you cure it with a UV light. Now, how long you cure it is really all dependent on the type of light you have. And you kind of got to test it out to see what works and what doesn't. For me, I cure my models for about 15 minutes under a UV light. Now, the great thing is, there are a lot of manufacturers out there that have cure and wash stations. Now, this is the route I went because I want it easy, and I don't want to always have to deal with everything. So what a wash station is it comes with some type of bucket that you can fill with isopropyl alcohol. This isn't full right now, but you see in the bottom here, there's actually an agitator, and that will spin and mix the resin and just kind of slosh it around in this bucket. But I'm sure you're wondering, so you just let that thing get beat up and just at the bottom? No. You put this in a basket, it hangs in there while that agitator spins around. So it really does a good job of cleaning all of your parts. Then once it's done, you just pull the basket out, and then you set it aside, let it all dry. Then there's a plate that you can put into your cure station, and it already has UV lights. So you just switch to cure, and then you hit the timer, and it will spin around and cure it for you. But the alternative is you have a couple buckets and you fill them full of isopropyl alcohol and you wash them out with a toothbrush or a little sponge or anything like that. Then you get a little turntable and put it with a UV light, hopefully in some type of little box, because you don't want UV light just shining everywhere in your room. Then you put your UV light and a little turntable in a little box, and you can set your model on that turntable and that UV light will go, and while it turns around and cures everything. Then you just kind of have to have a timer. And that's the cheaper way of doing it. Wash and cure stations are anywhere from $150 and, well, let's just say up. They do get expensive depending on the sizes, but they are very convenient and handy. For me, even though I have a wash and cure station, I still use a bucket to wash out some of my parts, because now that I have this EPAX E10, the thing's massive. It's got a 10-inch build plate. So it doesn't always fit in that bucket when I'm 3D printing stuff. So I have to wash it by hand. So you've got to think, if you've got a small printer, a little wash and cure station would work just fine with you. But if you have a big printer, it doesn't always work. Then once you're done with all of that curing, it's ready to touch, and you can just touch it with your hands. It's perfectly safe. But then it's ready for processing, and if you're curious on the things you need to do when you're processing your resin 3D prints, I've already made a video showing you exactly what I do, and I'll go ahead and put a link for it right up here for you. Or there. There, I think. Then after the processing, you're free to set it on a shelf somewhere, or actually start painting that beautiful print. Alright, real quick. I gotta do it. I just gotta say thank you to all of these awesome people for supporting me on Patreon this month. And if you want to be one of my patrons, you will get exclusive access to all of my private Discord channels where we talk about 3D printing, painting 3D prints, showing off some amazing works of art, and just generally talking about anything about the hobby. It's been an amazing community. But you'll also get access to all of my behind-the-scenes content. I show you what I'm working on before I put it out. And I put up Patreon-only tutorials. But the best part, you get to vote on some of the videos that I make each month. This video right here was actually the winner of this month of Resin 101. Because my patrons wanted to know more about resin 3D printing, and here we go. If you're interested, I'll go ahead and put a link below. Other than that, let's get back to this video. So let me take a minute to just talk about some of the best use cases for if you think you need a resin 3D printer. I'll tell you what, some of the best things for it is small, detailed models. Let's just say if you play D&D like me, printing minis, fantastic. It gets so much detail, it's unbelievable. With my 8K resin printer, it astounds me the level of detail, and you can't physically see it until you get paint on it and start seeing some of those textures show through. I'm very grateful for my Resin 3D printer when it comes to any of those high detailed things. So when it comes to printing things that are very small, thin, and delicate, that's where a Resin 3D printer shines. So printing minis for like D&D or games, I mean, it's fantastic. That is really one of the biggest uses for a lot of people is printing minis. Printing any kind of highly detailed models, FDM is great, but FDM can't get the level of detail just because of how it prints. A layer height on an FDM printer, if you are at 0.08 millimeters, that's like, wow. Like, that's a really good layer height for FDM. For this, I print at a 0.03 millimeters. And that's what I just typically print at. I'm pretty sure this thing could go lower than that, but I just don't have a need for it because of the level of detail. The layer lines, you cannot physically see them. When I'm doing my 3D prints, there are times where I don't have to sand one single thing. It's just perfect. I take the supports off and it's good to go. So that's one of the biggest differences between FDM and resin is just the high level of quality. So if you want some high level detail and FDM isn't doing it for you, resin is where it's at. Now the one thing I will say, resin is a lot more fragile than FDM. If you drop a resin 3D print, it will break. But if you drop an FDM, gosh, I've dropped some of my stuff down flights of stairs and they're just fine. Because FDM is a lot more tough, but resin is more delicate, so you have to be careful with it. Now the last thing I'm going to be talking about is if it's even right for you. And I have actually had friends that I have persuaded them not to get Resin 3D printers, even though they print FDM all day and they love 3D printing. And you're probably wondering, why would you tell somebody not to get one? And it's because of circumstances. Sometimes circumstances matter more than what you want to do, because there are safety precautions when it comes to this. Resin is caustic. That means if it gets on your skin, it can actually get you severe rashes or worse. So you don't want this around where anybody can just have full access to it. So the people that I have actually steered away from Resin 3D printing, they have all had one thing in common. They've all had little kids. Because little kids don't know any better sometimes, and they could easily pick up a resin print that's not cured and it's not safe for them to touch and it could hurt them. So if you have little ones, you really need to think about whether you should get a Resin 3D printer or not. Now, the one thing that I will say, if you have areas to where your children are not allowed or they don't go, or maybe you have a room with a locked door, then yes, Resin 3D printing would be perfectly fine for you. But I would hate, as a father, I would just hate for some child to get hurt because they just didn't know any better and they accidentally got into an area where they shouldn't have and started messing with your 3D prints, because in the past they were allowed to touch them. But these, they shouldn't be touching them. Not until they're cured, I will say. The next is if you don't have an area with good ventilation. I know I've already touched on it, but you need to have some type of ventilation. I don't have a ventilation hooked up to this actual 3D printer. My other Photon 3D printer, I actually hooked up a ventilation system directly to it. I 3D printed a back plate that I could connect a dryer vent to, and I just turned on my vent and sucked all the air out from inside it. But this one doesn't do that. But this room I'm in, I have my paint booth right here, and I turn on my ventilation system every single time that this thing is running. Another big thing to consider is cost. One of these bottles cost me $44. That's a lot. When I can get a spool of filament for around $17 to $20 a spool. And I would say they're almost equivalent of the amount that they print. But it's hard to give an apples to apples comparison because a spool and a bottle are kind of hard to compare. But I would say they're somewhat equal depending on the prints. If I'm printing a bunch of big things, I don't know, because I can make my big things on my resin printer hollow, and I support just a couple things on the inside, while my FDM printer will be doing an infill and just using all of that filament everywhere. But if you're a person that just kind of has this as a hobby on the side and you dabble in it and you don't want to put a lot of money into it, this might not be the thing for you, because you got to get all of this stuff, all of the alcohol, washing stations, and gloves, safety glasses, respirators. I mean, there's a lot that comes with this before you even get started. But on the other hand, if you're like me and you realize you're just going to keep dumping money into your hobby because you're addicted to it, then welcome. Now, there are tons of little nuances about resin printing that can just be annoying, and I've only skimmed the surface of it just to give you a basic understanding. But if you've been resin 3D printing for quite some time now, I'm kind of curious to hear what you guys think are those little nuances that just drive you nuts. For me, it's every single time I have a fail, I have to clean my vat. It drives me nuts. So check back next week, and I am going to be going in depth about all of the safety precautions you need to be aware of when you're resin 3D printing. So I hope this video has helped you and maybe guided you in the right direction of resin printing and just kind of give you a good foundation of what it's really about. Thanks for sticking around. I hope you all have a great day, and I'll go ahead and see you in the next video.